Our Bible reading for this week is going to be in Acts chapter 14, and it might be helpful to recommend that people go back and read 13 and 14 together.
It's one story.
It is. It tells the story of the first journey. So if you want a
Right.
big idea for chapter 14, it is the back end
That's right.
of the journey. We're going to reach the farthest outgoing place
Right.
before they turn and go back where they started in Antioch. So if you want a little structure of the chapter, first 7 verses tell us about some work in the city of Iconium. And then picking up verse 8, we have some work in the city of Lystra. Finally, verse 21, the latter part of the chapter is devoted to telling us about how they made their way back home. So let's start with Iconium
Right.
as we begin to get to the furthest reach of the first journey. I thought that what transpires here is really just kind of programmatic for how it often looked in these cities. They went in, they did some preaching, they had responsive people, and then they had opposition. Verse 4 says the city was divided,
Right.
and so they had to leave. And so, how often does it play out that way?
Absolutely. That's going to be kind of the program in almost every city. And Dave, I think it's interesting to remind ourselves even today, the gospel always brings opposition, and people
That's a good
often get
point.
upset and riled up. That's the way the church started. That's the way the gospel started, and nothing's changed today. It often does divide people and places and families, and it is a word that separates.
I also think it's interesting to ponder the occasions where God intervenes and protects.
Yeah.
And we see that here.
Absolutely.
There was a plot to mistreat them, and verse 6 says they became aware of it. I'm going to be inclined to attribute that to the providence of God. We see that in other places.
Right.
And yet there were times where God does not intervene, and
Right.
they are jailed, or they are beaten, or they
Right.
are stoned. And it's just interesting that sometimes God prevents and sometimes He doesn't.
Right.
I guess as part, we should say as part of His broader plan,
That's right. Yeah, sometimes he delivers miraculously, but sometimes we suffer for the sake of the gospel. That's their story.
and sometimes ours too.
Absolutely.
Okay, so moving on to Lystra.
Right. A little bit more here.
Well, we have a healing
Right.
that has a tremendous response. Could we maybe call it an overreaction?
Oh, just a little. They're ready to sacrifice to him as though they're gods.
Yeah.
Incarnate, ironically.
14:11, the gods have become like men. Interesting phrase, because God did become like men.
Ironically.
But not in these guys, right?
Right.
The interesting thing here is one moment they're ready to worship him like gods.
Yep.
The next moment they're stoning him in the street.
Yep.
And that's one of the places where God did not intervene and prevent
That's right.
the suffering of his guys. So just how fickle the crowds can be, I think, is really illustrated by
That's right.
by this story.
Yeah, that's really profound, actually, and stunning. And I think the other thing that's interesting is Paul and Barnabas' reaction to the attempt to deify them. They're about to sacrifice
Isn't
in
that
their
important?
honor. I think it's crucial. I think it's in some ways echoes back to Acts chapter 12. Remember a couple of weeks ago when Herod receives praise as though he were a god, and God strikes him dead for it. He's eaten with worms, as the old translation goes. And yet here, when Paul and Barnabas realize that they're about to sacrifice to them and worship them as though they are Zeus and Hermes among them, they rapidly go out and say in verse 15, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? We are men of like nature like you. And so it's interesting there that they immediately and humbly push back and say, we're just men. They refuse to accept worship. I think the other interesting thing there is this is one of the only two places that I can think of in Acts, David, where Paul talks not so much to a crowd that's seeking and listening to the gospel. He has to talk to kind of the people of the city more generically.
Yeah.
He'll do this in Athens as well in chapter 17 when he's on the Areopagus, Mars Hill. And he's just talking to people who are curious but not really seeking. And he delivers a brief word here. And it's interesting, David, and the way he tries to talk to just pagans who are otherwise just around. His point, his apologetic is that God is the creator. That's the angle. How do you talk to polytheists? People believe in lots of small g gods. How do you try to get their attention? This is the God who can account for everything, not just a little bit, not just the God of the sea or the sky or something like that. This is the God who can account for everything. He's the creator who made heaven and earth and all things in it.
I think that would be one of the values of studying the speeches
That's right.
that we find in Acts. We've talked about that before. And maybe one piece of that is to pay attention to who they're talking to.
That's right.
And realize that the message was always tailored
That's right.
for the audience. And that's a valuable application for us because I
Absolutely.
think we're living in a world where increasingly we encounter people who don't share the same fundamental worldview that we do.
Right.
And so you can't start by talking about baptism.
You can't just have one script. Paul can change the sermon based on who he's talking to.
Exactly. All right. Verse 21 begins the return.
Right.
Though it's a bit of a bizarre return. They don't do when I'm going home. When I'm going home, when I'm done with a trip, fastest route home.
That's right.
And he didn't do that.
No, I think it's important. We're not used to that part of the world. We don't think in terms of the geography and the map. But if you put what he's doing on the map, as he comes to the end of the journey to Lystra and to Derbe a little bit, from Derbe back to Antioch in Syria, it's not that far on foot, relatively speaking. For him to go back to these cities and retrace his steps before going back to Syria and Antioch and the congregation there is actually the long way around, but he does it for a reason. He goes back to strengthen those disciples, and because he had to leave often under such difficult circumstances to help establish elders in each congregation, we're told.
Yeah. There's some key words there.
There are some
You
huge
mentioned
words
words
there.
strengthen.
Yep.
And then also, we're still in verse 22, encourage.
Yep.
And then the other key word I saw there was tribulation.
As he himself has exemplified.
Exactly. So his message is, hey, be strong, hang in there, because sometimes it's going to be difficult.
Right.
And then at the very end of that, the key word is appointed, because he appoints elders who I think will help with everything else that
That's
he's
right.
already been talking about.
And so he literally went the extra mile. He went the long way home for the spiritual good of these brethren, these new Christians.
And then finally, there at the very end, when they get back to Antioch, they report about their work. And I love that language at the end of 27. And they talk about how God has opened a door of faith to the Gentiles.
Right.
Remember, we've been saying about that. At Acts 10, things begin kind of shift from focusing on a Jewish audience.
Right.
Now we're focused on a Gentile audience. And we see that work going on throughout this first journey.
Absolutely.
So you might want to read Acts 13 and 14 together and get the whole picture of the first journey.